Remember over the last 2 years how there were huge protests in the streets of Hong Kong against China taking over more and more control in the city? Well, those protests are almost gone now, and not because the protesters got sick of protesting, but because it became illegal under the new national security law imposed on Hong Kong by China. Now, however, dozens of lawmakers and political opposition people are being arrested, so it's really taking the control that the CCP has in Hong Kong to a whole new level. My name is Soren and welcome to the channel. Make sure to watch the whole video. I've got a lot of interesting info for you guys. This is taking place as we speak, so check this out, guys. Dozens of Hong Kong opposition figures arrested under national security law. Dozens of former lawmakers and opposition activists were arrested Wednesday morning, just this morning, in Hong Kong on suspicion of violating the city's sweeping national security legislation in the biggest crackdown yet since the law was imposed by Beijing last year in late June. At least 53 people were arrested, police said, for the crime of subverting state power. Could mean almost anything. Among the 53, 6 were arrested for organizing and planning a primary election held last July, 6 months ago, while the remaining 47 were arrested owing to their participation in the event, which was designed to thin the field of pro-democracy candidates ahead of legislative elections in September. Speaking to reporters later Wednesday, a police spokesman said, "The investigation is ongoing. We will not rule out arresting more people," adding that more than 1,000 officers had been involved in the operation, which saw 72 locations searched and more than $200,000 in assets frozen. So authorities in Hong Kong see the whole move that the pro-democracy group is making as subverting state power. And the problem here is that subverting state power is a term introduced back in June when they implemented this new national security law in Hong Kong. So now they see any kind of pro-democracy group gathering and trying to create their own, even if it's unofficial elections, they see that as subverting state power. So what did all of these people arrested do wrong? Well, they held these unofficial polls where if they had an election, they would do a poll and they would see if some of these pro-democracy people were popular among the people of Hong Kong. This article talks about it. Take a look at this. The biggest mass arrest under the national security law in Hong Kong took place on Wednesday morning as more than 50 former opposition lawmakers and activists were rounded up for their part in a primary election runoff last July. So this primary election runoff was held in the middle of July, and the national security law was implemented in late June, almost right before these polls and these runoff elections were done. So they almost even couldn't stop it, but that's basically what these people are being arrested for right now. Half a year later, they're investigating with thousands of police officers who participated in what they would call subverting state power, who participated in these runoff elections, which basically just amounts to the people of Hong Kong trying to see if one of these pro-democracy politicians could actually be elected if it was in a real election, right? So it's another clear example of how the Chinese government is beginning to take over more and more control in Hong Kong and beginning to allow less and less freedom of thought, and all of these pro-democracy groups are having a very difficult time. With anti-government sentiments running high in the wake of 2019 protests, the opposition camp estimated it could win enough seats in the geographical and trade-based constituencies during the scheduled September 2020 let-go elections to yield a majority of 35+ slots, a massive constitutional weapon to veto the budget and disrupt government, Tai said at the time. So arresting all of these people involved in this pro-democracy movement is a very effective way of shutting what China sees as an insurrection down. To be fair, we did have with the protests, there were violent parts of the protests, and I've spoken to people within Hong Kong who says everything from my shops were being destroyed by these people rummaging the streets. They would throw bricks in through, like you see in America or in other countries. Sometimes really good justified protests just take a violent turn because there'll always be few people who's going to ruin it for everyone else, or who's going to devastate the cause that you're trying to fight for. And sometimes the media focuses on the violent protesters when it's convenient. Other times they just completely ignore it. In the case with the protests in Hong Kong, they took place almost over the duration of 2 years. Some of them did become violent, and I don't think that's disputed. So something needed to happen. And I don't think most people are angry with the CCP lending support and trying to quell the violent parts of the protests. But you don't see any protests in the streets in Hong Kong anymore, because now not only are there no more protesters in the streets, but it's actually become illegal, because you could be fined and you could be put to jail for a long time under the same rules of the national security law that was imposed back then in June. And now there's no more, you can't protest anymore openly in the streets. So that's why you don't see them anymore. It's not because people got tired of protesting or something. To me, what's the most sad about these protests ending is that it gave the people of Hong Kong a voice. And when you take away the voice of the people, you shouldn't be surprised when you get an uprising against the government. Carrie Lam is a woman who's the chief executive in Hong Kong. She's supposed to be the voice of the people, but she's been criticized for a long time now because she's obviously taking the side of the CCP government way more than trying to represent the people who are against the encroaching takeover of the Chinese government into Hong Kong. So take a look at this. Chief Executive says her biggest hope for 2021 is social harmony, so government and public bodies have more room to solve problems instead of worrying about like freedoms and democracy and silly ideas like that. She also says every time there's a social conflict, that's a huge price to be paid, Lam said. So my biggest hope for 2021 is social harmony, so the government and various public bodies will have more room to do more pragmatic things for Hong Kong. I think most people in Hong Kong realized that their freedoms wouldn't last forever, that it was just a matter of time before the CCP would take over more and more control until they gain complete power in Hong Kong as well. But I do feel like the violent sides of the protests gave the CCP an excuse to come in and then perform this national security law that would be put over all of Hong Kong, and that would give, in the beginning, it would only give the CCP limited control, but now later, after the national security law was implemented, the CCP gained way more control when they began taking over the legislative branch of Hong Kong as well, which they're supposed to have. Hong Kong is famed for having this one country, two systems, where when it was given back to China by the Brits in 1997, the China agreed that they wouldn't intervene in the whole one country, two systems, that Hong Kong would have their own system for 50 years, up until 2047, it must be, right? Yeah, I got the math right. That they wouldn't intervene for that long, but obviously at this point, I don't think anyone would say that there's a free Hong Kong anymore. I don't think anyone would say that they even have their own system. So obviously China kind of didn't care about the agreement that they made with the Brits. And that's a worrying sign, because right now, sure, it's like Hong Kong by many is considered a part of China. And for some people looking in from the outside, they might think that this is just China taking over what they would eventually take over anyways, right? But the problem is that if you let go on one principle, soon another one will follow right after. And in this case, the next country that China is setting their eyes on is Taiwan. And Taiwan, again, is one of these countries that historically has belonged to China sometimes, but they are their own nation as recognized by all other countries in the world except China. But now China, there are reports about the Chinese government beginning to do these drills on the beach of how to invade. Basically, they do it on the beach, but basically you understand it's out of the coast of Taiwan. And it's a very clear signal that China is probably not going to be stopped by anyone. Taiwan had their allies in the US, at least up until recent. We're yet to see if Biden will have the same sense of alliance with Taiwan as Trump did. But Taiwan began signing these huge military deals with the US, and those, I think they will still go on. But Taiwan will have a hard time defending itself against China if they don't have an ally in the end of the day, I don't think Biden will be an ally in favor of Taiwan instead of China. That's yet to be seen, but I do think that it's sad to see Hong Kong lose a lot of their sovereignty, or at the very least a lot of their independence, a lot of their own way of life and their own system. I've been following the protests and the fight for freedom that Hong Kong has had for a couple of years, most intensely over the last couple of years. And it's really a shame to see that Hong Kong is losing a lot of their own rights and their freedoms in the city. I do want to mention in the end that I have spoken to people from Hong Kong who see it both ways, that they see that they are losing freedoms, but at the same time they don't have that bad of an image of the CCP government. They actually look to China and see that a lot of people are beginning to get rid of poverty in China, and the CCP, for its people, are making a lot of good steps and good decisions. It's easy sometimes as an outsider to look in and say everything on one side is all bad and everything on the other side is all good, but it's too simplistic. That's almost never how life is. I try to look at things objectively, but I do think that Hong Kong should have kept its independence, kept its freedoms, and most importantly, its way of doing life. Its way of doing everything. But now it'll be taken over more and more by China as time goes. On that cherry note, on that happy final statement, thanks for checking out my video, guys, on this update on the Hong Kong situation. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the future videos. See you guys. Have a good day.